My name is Benita Brown. I was 45 the morning my father sat across a cold glass conference table and signed away the only home I had ever known. The scratch of his fountain pen on the heavy paper of the quitclaim deed echoed in the quiet room. It sounded like a match striking dry wood. I sat at the far end of the table and watched the ink settle into the page. My younger brother Harrison sat next to him, breathing so hard a thin layer of sweat coated his forehead under the bright fluorescent lights. Beside him, his wife Naomi kept smoothing the lapel of her white blazer to hide the nervous tremor in her hands. My father slid the document toward the center of the table and looked right at me. He smiled a tight, proud smile and announced that it was time Harrison had a real home because he had a real family now. They all looked at me then. They expected a scene. They braced for me to mention the decade of property taxes I had paid on that Coral Gables estate. They thought I would bring up the new slate roof I funded from my own savings just last spring so my parents could live comfortably on their fixed income. I did not say a single word. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my breathing steady. I manage wealth for a living in Miami. I spend my days building financial fortresses for clients who demand perfection, and I know exactly what a bad investment looks like. For 10 years, I had treated my parents like a sacred investment. I shielded them from the friction of the world. I kept their lives comfortable, and in return, they looked right past me to hand the keys to a son who had never paid a single bill in that house. My family had just become a bad investment. But here's what my father did not know as he capped his expensive pen. He did not know that the young closing attorney standing at the head of the table was about to be interrupted. He did not know that an older, retired lawyer was waiting in the hallway with a sealed envelope that had been locked in a fireproof safe for 7 long years. The moment my father signed that paper, he triggered a legal clause he thought he had successfully buried. He was not giving the estate to his son. He was legally voiding his own ownership and transferring every single brick of that $3 million property directly to me. What happened when that envelope finally opened and the truth spilled across that glass table is the reason I am sitting here today sharing this with you. Welcome back to Linda Vengeance, where we tell true-to-life stories about family boundaries, dignity, and the exact moment someone stops paying the entrance fee for a family that never valued them. If you have ever been the dependable one who gets overlooked for the golden child, this one is for you. Tell me your age and where you are listening from in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. To understand how we ended up in that icy conference room, you have to rewind 3 weeks to a dinner table in Coral Gables. The Mediterranean estate smelled of roasted garlic and sea salt when I arrived that Tuesday evening. My mother Evelyn had summoned me for what she vaguely termed a celebratory milestone. I had just finished a 12-hour day untangling a corporate merger for a client. I was tired, but I put on a fresh blouse and drove across town, because that is what dependable daughters do. I walked into the dining room and found my family already seated. The ambient lighting caught the silver streaks in my mother's hair and reflected off the polished mahogany table. Harrison and Naomi sat across from my usual chair. Harrison kept checking his phone under the table. His knee bounced up and down, hitting the wooden leg of the table with a rhythmic thud. My mother set her silver fork down and folded her hands. She looked at Harrison, and then she looked at me. Her expression held the practiced warmth she usually saved for charity galas. She announced that she and my father were downsizing. She said the house was too much work, and they had decided to gift the estate to my brother. I sat very still. The estate was appraised at $3.5 million. It was not just a house. It was the anchor of our family history. I looked at my father, Richard, who was busy cutting his steak as if we were discussing the weather. I asked if they were gifting it outright. My father did not look up from his plate. He said Harrison and Naomi needed the space. He said they had the children to think about. Then my mother leaned forward and delivered the line she had prepared. She smiled and said I had my career. She said I had already built my own life, and I had my portfolios to keep me busy. She told me I did not need a sprawling home just for myself. The air in the room grew thin. The message was clear. Harrison had provided the traditional optics of a wife and heirs. I had only provided the financial stability that kept the roof over their heads. In their eyes, I was a useful utility, but I was not a true legacy. My mother reached for the bottle of vintage Cabernet resting in the center of the table. It was a bottle I had purchased for their anniversary 2 years prior. She poured a generous measure into Harrison crystal glass. She poured another for Naomi. Then, without looking, she reached for the condensation-beaded pitcher and slid a glass of tap water toward my plate. I stared at the water. The ice cubes clinked against the rim. I felt a cold knot form in the center of my chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation for the disrespect. I picked up my linen napkin and folded it into a neat square beside my untouched glass. I watched my brother. Harrison did not look like a man who had just inherited a fortune. He looked sick. He picked up his wine glass, but his hand shook so much a drop of dark red liquid spilled onto the white tablecloth. He muttered something about needing to knock down the load-bearing walls in the living room to open up the space. Naomi shot him a look that could freeze boiling water. She interrupted him smoothly, telling my parents they just wanted to modernize the interior for the kids. But I heard the panic in Harrison's voice. You do not talk about gutting load-bearing walls the minute you are gifted a family heirloom, unless you are calculating its resale value. When dessert arrived, I excused myself. I walked out into the long tiled hallway to retrieve my coat from the closet. The antique grandfather clock ticked in the corner, keeping its slow, steady rhythm in the quiet house. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Aunt Denise stepping out of the shadows near the study. Denise was my mother's estranged stepsister. She was a brilliant African-American woman who had spent 30 years as a corporate auditor. She had arrived late to the dinner and sat at the far end of the table drinking black coffee and watching the dynamics unfold with her sharp, dark eyes. Denise stood next to me and kept her voice low. She told me the math did not make sense. I asked her what she meant. She looked toward the dining room archway and whispered that she had helped my father set up a basic trust ledger 2 months ago. She said she had seen their liquid account balances. Denise told me my parents had not just given Harrison the keys to the house. She said their retirement accounts were drained bare. A cold chill ran down my arms. My parents were on a fixed income. They relied on those accounts for their daily living expenses. Denise told me something was rushing them. She said they were liquidating their own safety net to push this house transfer through, and it had nothing to do with familial generosity. I looked past Denise and saw my father's leather briefcase resting on the hall table. The brass latches were undone. A single sheet of paper protruded from the edge of the leather flap. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a preliminary deed transfer document printed on the letterhead of a local title company. I stared at the paper and realized the polished surface of my family had just fractured. My parents were hiding a dark, desperate truth, and they were willing to sacrifice my future to protect my brother. It took me several weeks and a small fortune in private investigation fees to piece together the exact events that unfolded after my brother and his wife left my parents' home that night. Court transcripts and sworn depositions eventually painted a vivid picture of their drive back to Brickell. The interior of their leased luxury sedan was suffocating. The leather seats smelled of expensive cologne and unspoken panic. Naomi sat in the passenger side, holding a club soda-soaked napkin. She methodically rubbed the fabric of her white designer blouse, focusing entirely on the single drop of wine Harrison had spilled during dinner. She scrubbed the delicate silk with a rhythmic, punishing intensity. This solitary action represented the core dynamic of their marriage. Naomi spent her days acting as a human shield, erasing my brother's careless mistakes before the world could notice them. She grew up in a household where status was the only currency that mattered. She viewed her marriage to Harrison not as a romantic partnership, but as a strategic corporate merger. She had calculated his earning potential against his family inheritance, and decided the long-term payout outweighed his short-term character flaws. Naomi was a senior corporate strategist who viewed life as a brutal balance sheet where every liability had to be neutralized. Right now, Harrison was her greatest liability. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a mottled raw white under the glow of the dashboard lights. He asked Naomi if she thought my mother and father suspected anything. Naomi did not stop scrubbing the stain. She stared at the damp fabric and told him our parents were too desperate for a perfect son to ever question the illusion standing right in front of them. She classified our mother and father as willing marks in a long con. My brother was not the brilliant entrepreneur my father boasted about during his golf games. 3 years prior, Harrison launched a tech startup using venture capital funding he secured, leveraging Naomi corporate connections. But Harrison loved the optics of wealth far more than the daily grind of running a business. He funneled the seed money into private chartered flights, luxury vehicle leases, and high-stakes poker games hidden in underground Miami card rooms. When the initial capital dried up, he panicked. Instead of admitting failure, he falsified quarterly revenue reports to secure a second round of funding. That single decision crossed the legal boundary, separating poor fiscal management from federal wire fraud. Traditional banking institutions caught the discrepancies early and blacklisted him from borrowing a single dime. Terrified of prison, Harrison turned to a shadow lender. He borrowed from a syndicate operating behind a sleek shell company located in downtown Miami. They wired him $2 million to cover the missing venture funds. But informal lenders do not care about business plans or emotional pleas. They care about hard collateral, and they charge ruinous interest rates. By the night of that celebratory dinner, Harrison owed the syndicate nearly $3 million. Inside the quiet car, his voice cracked. He asked Naomi what would happen if the title company delayed the property transfer. Naomi finally dropped the ruined napkin onto the floorboard. She turned her cold, calculating gaze toward him and delivered a chilling reality check. She reminded him she had clawed her way to the top of the compliance sector, and she refused to lose her professional licenses because she married a felon. Naomi engineered the entire real estate extraction herself. She never harbored a single intention of moving into my childhood home. The moment my father verbally promised the estate to Harrison, she marched into a private wealth office and secured a predatory bridge loan. She used the impending deed transfer as the primary collateral to generate enough cash to pay off the shadow syndicate. Her strategy was ruthlessly efficient. She planned to sell the Coral Gables property to a commercial developer the very second the ink dried on the title. They would bulldoze the walls, pay off the bridge lender, and pocket the remaining $500,000 of equity. My parents believed they were gifting a legacy to their grandchildren. In reality, they were feeding their life savings into a wood chipper to keep their son out of a federal penitentiary. Harrison pulled the sedan into the driveway of their rented townhouse. The engine hummed as he shifted the car into park. He unbuckled his seatbelt, but stopped when Naomi reached across the console and grabbed his wrist. Her fingernails dug into his skin. She commanded him to stay focused and play his part flawlessly. She ordered him to act like the grateful, nesting father our parents desperately wanted to see. She instructed him to compliment my mother cooking, ask my father for lawn care advice, and keep the old fools docile until the closing documents were stamped. Harrison swallowed hard and nodded. He opened his mouth to agree, but a sharp buzzing sound cut through the heavy silence. It was not his primary phone. The noise originated from a cheap plastic prepaid device hidden deep inside the center console beneath a plastic cup holder insert. Naomi let go of his wrist. She pulled the plastic tray up and retrieved the burner phone. The screen illuminated her face with a pale blue light. As she read the incoming encrypted text message, all the color drained from her cheeks. The confident corporate strategist vanished, replaced by a woman staring directly into a financial abyss. The shadow lenders were not willing to wait for a standard 30-day real estate closing window. The message was concise and terrifying. The syndicate had audited his frozen accounts and discovered the impending title transfer. They knew he was trying to leverage the property to escape them. The digital text gave him a strict, unyielding ultimatum. They demanded the cash in exactly 10 days. If the funds did not clear their offshore accounts by that exact deadline, they would initiate a quiet lien on his remaining personal assets and forward his falsified revenue reports directly to the authorities. The timeline collapsed instantly. Harrison stared at the glowing screen as his breathing grew shallow and erratic. 10 days was not enough time to clear a standard title search, much less execute a complex commercial property sale. The trap was closing around them, and the only way out required them to force my parents to sign the deed faster than legally advisable. They needed to bypass standard protocols and push the paperwork through a rushed closing. Harrison buried his face in his hands, realizing his survival now depended on manipulating our parents into rushing a transaction they barely understood. Naomi tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. She looked at her husband with a mixture of disgust and sheer self-preservation. She told him to dry his eyes and get out of the car. She said they were going to call my mother first thing in the morning and convince her that the kids needed to move into the estate before the new school term started. They had to manufacture a family emergency to force the sale. The deception was escalating rapidly, and neither of them realized I was already pulling their financial footprint apart, piece by piece, from my own office. The morning sun baked the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown Miami office, but I felt only cold. Biscayne Bay sparkled far below in shades of turquoise and emerald, yet my focus remained locked on the dual glowing monitors resting upon my mahogany desk. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning provided a sterile, quiet environment. I needed that silence to function. Aunt Denise had planted a seed of profound dread in my mind the night before. Now I required the harvest of truth. As a senior wealth manager, I possessed specialized access to advanced financial tracking software. My parents had signed a durable power of attorney, authorizing me to oversee their portfolios nearly 15 years ago. They never formally revoked that legal authority. They simply stopped asking for my advice when my brother required their full attention. I logged into the secure banking terminal. My keystrokes were sharp, deliberate, and unyielding. I pulled up my father's Social Security profile and initiated a soft inquiry into his recent transaction history. The loading graphics spun for 3 agonizing seconds. When the numerical data finally populated across my screen, the breath left my lungs in a sudden, painful rush. Denise possessed an auditor-flawless intuition. The math did not merely fail to make sense. It represented a fiscal slaughter. My parents had not just gifted a multi-million-dollar estate to Harrison. The Internal Revenue Service imposes strict, steep levies on property transfers of that magnitude, unless sheltered by an intricate trust framework. My mother and father had ignored every piece of tax mitigation advice I ever provided them during my entire career. To cover the immediate state transfer fees and the projected federal gift tax burden, they had initiated emergency liquidations across their entire portfolio. I stared at the endless rows of red negative numbers scrolling down the interface. They had cashed out their primary retirement accounts. They incurred devastating early withdrawal penalties on a series of stable municipal bonds I had personally selected for them a decade ago. They emptied the high-yield savings account specifically intended for their late-stage medical care. The liquid capital was gone. They had transformed themselves into financial ghosts overnight. By handing that deed to Harrison, my parents had rendered themselves secretly destitute. They were walking a frayed tightrope with zero safety net underneath. My right hand reached out and picked up an antique silver pen resting beside my keyboard. The heavy metal felt cool and solid against my palm. This writing instrument was a college graduation gift from my late grandfather Thomas. He was a stern, unforgiving man who built his fortune from the ground up running a regional logistics firm. He despised the very concept of unearned wealth. I held his gift and began to tap the smooth barrel against the polished mahogany wood. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound grounded my rising panic. My internal alarms were screaming. The dutiful daughter inside me wanted to pick up the telephone right then and halt the disastrous transaction. I possessed the legal authority to freeze their accounts pending a formal competency review. I could stop the financial bleeding today. I could save my mother and father from their own reckless, blind devotion. I could force them to acknowledge that Harrison would never support them when their physical health eventually failed. But the seasoned wealth manager inside me remained brutally detached. I remembered the careless slide of that tap water glass across the dining table the previous evening. I recalled my father dismissing my lifelong loyalty as a convenient byproduct of my single status. They had weighed my decade of quiet financial stewardship against my brother's chaotic existence, and they chose his chaos. They willingly threw their twilight years into a furnace just to keep my brother warm. The tapping stopped. I gripped the silver pen tightly. I made a silent, irreversible choice. I would not save them from their own actions. I would not intervene to protect their depleted bank accounts. If they wished to bet their survival on a son who could not even balance a basic checkbook, I would let them place the fatal wager. However, I refused to walk away blind. I needed to understand the exact mechanical structure of the impending real estate transaction. I closed the banking portal and opened the Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser public database. The digital registry was a matter of open record. I typed in the parcel identification number for the Coral Gables estate. The screen flickered and loaded the chain of title history. I bypassed the current tax assessments and scrolled down to the recorded deeds. I pinpointed the specific entry from late 2019. That was the year grandfather Thomas passed away, and the estate legally transferred to my parents. I clicked the hyperlink to open the scanned document of the original warranty deed. The file was an old scan filled with dense, archaic legal jargon. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the text with the tip of the silver pen. My grandfather did not hand the property over in a simple, straightforward transfer. He was far too paranoid for that kind of careless simplicity. The primary text designated Richard and Evelyn Brown as the primary grantees. But as I read the covenants and restrictions, my eyes caught a glaring anomaly buried deep within the fourth paragraph. The clause explicitly stated that the transfer of ownership was subject to the conditions detailed in Schedule B of the Thomas Brown Revocable Trust. I scrolled down, expecting to find the attached schedule outlining those exact conditions. The file ended abruptly. The next page was a blank filler sheet. I refreshed the database. I ran a secondary search through the county clerk auxiliary records. Nothing appeared. Schedule B was missing from the digital registry entirely. It was a ghost document. Someone had deliberately omitted the addendum when filing the primary deed 7 years ago. My grandfather never drafted a contract without a hidden tripwire. He understood human weakness better than anyone in our bloodline. If he attached a secondary schedule to the deed, it meant he placed a strict, unbreakable restriction on what my parents could actually do with the house. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My parents might not even possess the legal authority to give the estate to Harrison. I needed the original paperwork. I opened my encrypted contact directory and searched for a specific name. Mr. Sterling was the senior estate attorney who had handled my grandfather affairs for 3 decades. He retired a few years after the funeral, closing his prominent downtown practice to live a quiet life in Boca Raton. I found his private residential number and picked up my desk phone. My heart hammered a steady, frantic beat against my ribs as the line dialed. I was no longer just an estranged daughter nursing a wounded ego. I was a forensic auditor, pulling a thread that threatened to unravel my entire family. The phone rang 3 times. A gravelly voice answered on the fourth ring. I introduced myself. I kept my tone even and professional. I asked him if he had a few moments to discuss a clerical discrepancy regarding the Thomas Brown estate. I heard the faint rustle of a newspaper in the background as the old man settled into his chair. He told me he always had time for Thomas' granddaughter. He asked how he could assist me. I stared at the blank page on my monitor. I told him I was looking at the 2019 county deed transfer for the Coral Gables property. I explained that the primary document referenced a restrictive covenant under Schedule B. I informed him that the addendum was entirely missing from the public digital archive, and I needed to know the exact nature of the restriction my grandfather placed on the property. The rustling of the newspaper stopped instantly. The line went dead silent. The silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard it. A sharp, sudden intake of breath. It was a raw, unfiltered gasp echoing through the receiver. It was the sound of an old man realizing a dormant trap had just been triggered. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the telephone line sounded like a physical fracture. Mr. Sterling was an attorney who had spent 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters of generational wealth. He did not gasp out of mere surprise. He gasped because he recognized the immediate shape of a disaster. He asked me in a strained whisper if my father was actually attempting to transfer the Coral Gables property to my brother. I confirmed the impending transaction. I told him about the celebratory dinner, the casual dismissal of my presence, and the rushed timeline Naomi was orchestrating to secure her bridge loan. Mr. Sterling fell into a heavy silence. As I listened to the faint static on the line, my mind drifted away from the glowing monitors on my desk. The sterile air of my modern office faded. I was suddenly pulled backward through time, transported to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago. My grandfather Thomas had arrived at my old firm unannounced. He refused the coffee my assistant offered and walked straight into my suite, closing the heavy oak door behind him. He wore a tailored wool suit that smelled faintly of cherry pipe tobacco and old paper. Even at 82 years old, he possessed the imposing physical presence of a man who commanded shipping ports and freight lines. His hands were calloused from decades of early labor, but his mind remained a steel trap. He sat in the leather guest chair and looked at me with a mixture of immense pride and profound exhaustion. He did not engage in small talk. He leaned forward, resting his weight on a silver-tipped walking cane, and delivered a ruthless assessment of his own bloodline. He told me Richard was a vain, foolish man. My grandfather despised my father's obsession with country club optics and leased luxury sedans. He said Richard cared more about the appearance of wealth than the grueling discipline required to maintain it. Then his voice grew darker as he spoke of Harrison. He viewed my brother as a dangerous liability. He knew about the hidden gambling debts, the failed tech ventures, and the constant bailouts my parents secretly funded. Thomas knew his legacy was in imminent danger of being squandered the moment his heart stopped beating. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. The gesture sparked a vivid childhood memory. I was 14 years old, standing in my grandparents' kitchen next to Harrison. Thomas had decided to test us. He handed us each a crisp, new $100 bill and told us to show him what we valued. My brother did not hesitate. Harrison ran straight to an upscale mall and purchased a pair of flashy designer sneakers. He paraded them around the house, seeking validation for a brand logo that scuffed and faded within a month. I took a different path. I walked 2 miles to the local bank branch down the street. I approached the teller, filled out a paper deposit slip, and purchased a long-term savings bond. When I returned to the kitchen and handed my grandfather the stamped receipt, he did not smile. He simply placed his rough hand on my shoulder, leaned down, and whispered a phrase I carried into adulthood. He told me, I was the vault. Sitting in my office 7 years ago, Thomas reminded me of that exact day. He said a vault was designed to protect things from people who lacked the discipline to protect themselves. He opened his briefcase and produced the preliminary drafts of his estate plan. He refused to leave his fortune vulnerable to my father vanity or my brother greed. Thomas explained the legal architecture he had commissioned Mr. Sterling to build. He structured the Coral Gables estate under a highly restrictive life estate with a limited power of appointment. The legalese was dense, but the practical application was brutally simple. Richard and Evelyn were granted the legal right to reside in the home to maintain the grounds and to enjoy the property until their passing. However, they were explicitly barred from designating Harrison as the remainder beneficiary. Thomas built a fortress around the deed. He placed a silent lock on the front door, ensuring the estate would bypass the reckless son and pass directly to the vault. I blinked, and the memory dissolved. I was back in the present, sitting at my mahogany desk, staring at the digital property registry. The ghost of my grandfather's intentions lingered in the cold air of the room. I gripped the silver pen tighter, realizing the true depth of the current betrayal. My parents were not simply playing favorites. They were knowingly attempting to bypass a dead-man ironclad legal directive. They were breaking a promise to the man who bought the roof over their heads. But a glaring logical flaw stopped my racing thoughts. I am a wealth manager who deals with property transfers daily. I know how the system operates. The title company processing Naomi Bridge loan would never permit a closing without a rigorous background check. The closing agents act as neutral third parties, tasked with ensuring the chain of ownership. They would run a comprehensive title search, discover the missing Schedule B, and immediately halt the transaction until the restrictions were clarified. I spoke into the telephone receiver, breaking the long silence. I asked Mr. Sterling how a commercial title company could possibly proceed with this sale. I told him Naomi had a closing date scheduled for next week. I explained that lenders do not hand over millions of dollars unless the collateral is pristine. The title agents were not foolish. They would demand to see the hidden addendum before allowing my father to sign the quit-claim deed. Mr. Sterling let out a slow, ragged sigh. His voice dropped to a grave, cautious whisper. He told me he still retained access to a private network of county clerks from his days in practice. When I mentioned the missing schedule, he had logged into a secondary portal while we were speaking to check the auxiliary filings. He told me the title company did not ask for Schedule B because they believed the restrictions no longer existed. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. I asked him to explain. Mr. Sterling detailed the nightmare he had just uncovered. 3 weeks ago, right around the time Naomi began securing her predatory loan, a new document was quietly recorded at the county courthouse. It was a formal revocation of trust. The document explicitly dissolved the restrictions placed on the Coral Gables property, clearing the path for a standard transfer. The paper bore the signature of Thomas Brown. It was stamped with a local notary seal and filed with all the correct processing fees. The title company reviewed this revocation, verified the visual markers of authenticity, and approved the clear title. They assumed the dead man had changed his mind. I stopped breathing. I stared at the silver pen in my hand. Mr. Sterling's voice trembled slightly as he delivered the final, devastating blow. He reminded me of the exact date printed on that filed revocation. The document claimed Thomas signed it 5 days before he passed away. We both knew the medical reality of that specific week. Grandfather Thomas suffered a severe stroke 6 days before his death. He spent his final week in a deep, unresponsive coma, relying on a ventilator to breathe. He never woke up. He never held a pen. He never signed a revocation. The truth settled over my office like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My parents had not just made a terrible financial decision. They had not just chosen my brother over me. To secure a clear title and save their golden child from his own ruin, Richard and Evelyn Brown had submitted a fabricated legal document to a government agency. They had crossed the boundary separating toxic family dynamics from actual criminal behavior. My parents had just committed felony forgery. The drive from downtown Miami to the Coral Gables estate usually took 40 minutes. I completed the journey in 30. I kept the car radio off, allowing the silent hum of the engine to match the cold, calculated rhythm of my thoughts. The bright Florida sun glared off the windshield, but my mind remained trapped in the dark reality of Mr. Sterling's shocking revelation. My parents had crossed a boundary I never thought possible. They abandoned their moral compass and committed a felony just to secure a bridge loan for a son who treated them like a disposable bank account. I turned my vehicle onto the familiar, crushed stone driveway of my childhood home. The heavy tires crunched over the white gravel announcing my arrival. I shifted into park and noticed a pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle parked at a crooked angle near the front steps. It belonged to Naomi. The careless parking job felt like a deliberate territorial marker. She was claiming the space, asserting her dominance over a property she did not yet legally own. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air. The scent of blooming bougainvillea mixed with the salty breeze rolling in from the coast. This house held every significant memory of my early life. I remembered learning to ride a bicycle on this driveway. I remembered studying for my university entrance exams on the second-floor balcony. Now the estate felt like an active crime scene. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air conditioning chilled the sweat on my neck. Instead of the usual quiet peace, I heard the sharp click of expensive high heels echoing against the terracotta floor tiles. A high-pitched electronic beep pierced the air. I walked toward the main living area and found my sister-in-law standing in the center of the room. Naomi wore a tailored emerald green dress that looked fresh off a runway. She held a sleek digital tablet in her left hand. A tall man in a fitted gray polo shirt stood beside her, holding a small black device. He pointed the plastic instrument at the far wall. A bright red laser dot danced across the vintage floral wallpaper, mapping the dimensions of the room. Naomi did not look surprised to see me. She did not offer a greeting. She simply swiped a finger across her tablet screen and issued a cold directive. She told me I needed to clear out the upstairs guest bedroom by Sunday evening. She referred to the space that used to be my childhood sanctuary. That room held my high school debate trophies, my old journals, and the classic literature collection my grandfather gifted me. Naomi did not care about the history contained within those four walls. She informed me the demolition crews were scheduled to arrive early Monday morning, and she refused to pay the contractors to haul away my sentimental clutter. I stood in the archway and watched her operate. She projected an aura of supreme confidence. She acted like a wealthy heiress redesigning her inherited castle. But I knew the truth. I knew she was a desperate woman, standing on top of a forged legal document, trying to outrun a shadow syndicate. The man in the polo shirt stepped forward. He introduced himself as the lead structural architect. He walked over to a thick wooden column positioned near the base of the grand sweeping staircase. The pillar featured intricate hand-carved details installed by the original builders nearly a century ago. He knocked his knuckles against the solid wood, listening to the dense thud it produced. He turned to Naomi and shook his head. He told her they could not remove that specific column to create the open concept floor plan she desired. He explained that the wooden pillar bore the primary weight of the entire second story. He warned her that if she pulled that support beam out, the whole structure would collapse inward and destroy the estate. I stared at the wooden column and felt a dark, heavy irony settle over the room. The architect traced the invisible load lines with his finger, completely unaware of the metaphor he just delivered. My family had built their entire future on a fragile, fabricated foundation. They removed the legal support beam the moment my father submitted that fraudulent trust revocation to the county clerk. The collapse was no longer a mere possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Naomi sighed loudly. She rolled her eyes at the architect and typed a frantic note into her tablet. She turned her sharp gaze back toward me. Her eyes swept up and down my sensible worksuit, evaluating my worth and finding it lacking. She offered a condescending smile. She told me a house of this magnitude was wasted on old memories and dusty trophies. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume filling the space between us. She lowered her voice to a patronizing whisper and claimed that real families needed space to grow. She weaponized my single status against me, implying I was a solitary, sterile figure, taking up unnecessary room in a world designed for mothers and children. A younger version of myself might have reacted with tears or raised a voice in righteous defense, but the wealth manager standing in that foyer felt nothing but a chilling, clinical detachment. I looked at the woman who was secretly drowning in predatory debt. She thought she held a winning hand. She had no idea I was sitting at the table, holding the only key to the vault. I smiled. It was a slow, tight, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. I kept my voice soft and measured. I told Naomi she did not need to worry about my belongings. I gave her permission to instruct the demolition crew to throw my debate trophies and old books directly into the dumpster. Her confident expression faltered for a fraction of a second, confused by my easy surrender. I did not fight for the relics of my past because I knew she would never get the chance to destroy them. I stepped backward toward the hallway. I maintained direct eye contact with her and delivered a final piece of advice. I told her she should listen very closely to her architect. I warned her to measure her surroundings carefully before she started tearing things down. I said structural mistakes carry a ruinous cost, and once the roof caves in, there is nowhere left to hide. I turned around before she could formulate a response. I walked down the long, shadowy corridor leading toward the back exit of the estate. The vintage floorboards creaked softly beneath my sensible shoes. As I passed the dark oak door of my father's private study, I heard a strange, muffled sound. The heavy door was cracked open just an inch. The interior lights were switched off, but the pale glow of a computer monitor illuminated a sliver of the room. I stopped walking. I held my breath and listened. A harsh, desperate whisper leaped through the narrow gap. It was Harrison. He was pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. I could hear the frantic scuff of his leather loafers. He was speaking into a mobile phone, his voice cracking under an immense, unseen pressure. He begged the person on the other end of the line for a slight extension. He pleaded for just 5 more days. He promised the closing documents would be signed and the equity would be liquidated by the end of the week. He swore the money was guaranteed. Then his tone shifted from begging to sheer, unadulterated terror. He told the caller they could not send a recovery team to his townhouse. He said they could not seize his leased luxury cars yet because his neighbors would see the tow trucks and the ensuing scandal would alert his investors. He was crying. My golden child brother was weeping in the dark, terrified of the financial predators circling his life. The shadow lenders were tightening the noose. The 10-day timeline had shrunk. The panic in his voice confirmed every piece of data I uncovered in my office. Harrison was out of time, and my parents were racing toward a closing table that would seal their ultimate doom. I drove north, away from the Coral Gables estate, leaving my brother weeping in the shadows of his dark study. The highway stretched toward Boca Raton, a gray ribbon of asphalt cutting through the humid Florida afternoon. My destination was a nondescript brick building tucked behind a fading strip mall. This unremarkable structure housed the secure private archives of my grandfather, retired estate attorney. I parked my car in the empty lot and approached the reinforced steel door. Mr. Sterling met me at the entrance. He wore a faded wool cardigan over a crisp dress shirt, looking every bit the weary guardian of buried secrets. He offered a grim nod and guided me past rows of empty reception desks into the climate-controlled vault situated in the back of the facility. The air inside the windowless room smelled of brittle parchment dust motes and aged leather binders. This silent space contained the true legacy of Miami founding business titans, documented in boxes stacked from the floor to the ceiling. We sat across a scarred wooden drafting table, illuminated by the harsh glow of a single overhead bulb. Mr. Sterling unlocked a heavy metal lockbox resting on the table and extracted a thick manila folder. He laid the faded papers flat, smoothing the curled edges with a trembling hand. These were the original, unredacted case files concerning the Thomas Brown Revocable Trust. The retired lawyer adjusted his reading glasses and looked at me with a profound, somber gravity. He began to dissect the brilliant, ruthless mechanics of the trap my grandfather had designed. Thomas knew Richard possessed a weak character. He anticipated my father might eventually succumb to outside pressures or emotional manipulation. To counter that inevitable failure, Thomas engineered a legal poison pill into the very foundation of the property transfer. Mr. Sterling traced a wrinkled finger along the dense paragraphs of Schedule B. He explained the complex legal concept of a conditional reversionary interest. My parents held the deed only under the strict stipulation that they maintain the physical grounds and never attempt to alter the succession line in favor of Harrison. The exact moment they submitted a fabricated revocation to the county clerk, they violated the primary covenant of their tenancy. The penalty for such a violation was instantaneous and unmerciful. The trust document dictated that any fraudulent attempt to bypass the established rules would immediately void my parents' ownership rights. Their life estate would evaporate into thin air. The property title would automatically bypass them, skipping over their generation entirely, and vest 100% in my name. A profound, heavy silence stretched across the dusty archive. I stared at the dense legal text, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the weapon resting on the drafting table. My initial instinct upon discovering their fiscal ruin earlier that morning was to halt the transaction. I wanted to freeze their banking accounts and prevent the property transfer. I thought I had to block the closing proceedings to protect my inheritance and save them from their own foolishness. Now the strategic landscape inverted completely. I did not need to raise a single objection. I did not need to hire an army of litigators to petition a judge for an emergency court injunction. If I stopped them before they signed the final closing documents, they would remain the legal residents of the estate. They would retain their life tenancy, and I would spend the next decade fighting them in probate court over a forged revocation attempt. To win this silent war, I had to do the exact opposite of my initial impulse. I needed to let them sit at that glass conference table. I had to watch my father pick up his expensive fountain pen. I must encourage them to execute the fraudulent quitclaim deed in front of sworn witnesses. Their signatures were the necessary catalyst. The moment the ink dried on those finalized closing papers, the trap would snap shut. They would sign away their own home and hand the keys directly to me. My role shifted from a discarded daughter into a quiet executioner. Mr. Sterling reached back into the metal lockbox and retrieved a rolled parchment tube. He untied a frayed silk ribbon and spread a faded architectural schematic across the wooden table. It was the original floor plan of the Coral Gables estate, drafted decades ago during the initial construction phase. He smoothed the curling corners and pointed a steady finger at the grand foyer layout. He tapped a specific notation marked near the base of the sweeping staircase. The architect had drawn a small rectangular outline, indicating the placement of a heavy antique grandfather clock. Mr. Sterling tapped the drawing twice. He reminded me of my grandfather's paranoid nature. Thomas trusted no one, not even the commercial banks or the digital county registries, to preserve his final wishes intact. Mr. Sterling folded his hands, resting them on top of the blue ink blueprints. His expression hardened into a strict, grim warning. He told me the automatic reversion clause was brilliant in legal theory, but perilous in practical execution. To spring the trap definitively at the closing table, I could not rely on digital copies or verbal arguments. The commercial title agents were moving exceptionally fast to appease the bridge lender. Naomi had successfully manipulated the timeline, creating a chaotic, rushed environment. If I merely raised a verbal objection during the final meeting, the closing agents might pause the proceedings, but the fraudulent revocation would still sit on the public record. Naomi could easily use that temporary delay to finalize her shadow loan, utilizing the contested property as collateral, throwing the entire estate into a decade of messy, expensive litigation. To execute a flawless checkmate and instantly override the forged county filing, Mr. Sterling warned I must produce the original ink-signed addendum. The physical document bearing my grandfather's authentic signature and the embossed notary seal was the singular instrument powerful enough to halt a commercial lender and legally strip my parents of their title in real time. He looked around the dusty archive room, shaking his head in quiet frustration. He confessed he did not possess the original paper. He only held the unsigned reference drafts and the attorney notes. When Thomas finalized the trust 7 years ago, he demanded to keep the singular master copy in his own personal possession. Mr. Sterling asked me if I had ever discovered a hidden wall safe or a secure floor lockbox during my frequent visits to the childhood house. I looked down at the hand-drawn square on the architectural floor plan. I remembered the rhythmic ticking echoing through the hallway the night of the celebratory dinner. I recalled the weight of the silver pen in my hand that morning and the final words Thomas whispered to me when I was a teenager standing in his kitchen. He called me the Vault. I met Mr. Sterling's weary gaze and offered a calm, steady reply. I told him we did not need to hire a contractor to search for a hidden wall safe. I explained that my grandfather possessed a twisted sense of poetic justice. Thomas wanted to hide the bitter truth in plain sight, right in the center of the home my family was so desperate to steal. I revealed that the original unredacted addendum had been folded, sealed in heavy wax, and taped inside the wooden pendulum casing of the grandfather clock for 7 long years. The Coral Gables Country Club patio offered a pristine view of the 18th hole. Evelyn Brown sat beneath a wide green canvas umbrella, shielding her face from the harsh midday sun. The air smelled of freshly cut Bermuda grass and expensive sunscreen. She wore a tailored white linen dress and a pair of oversized designer sunglasses. 3 other women sat around the circular wrought iron table. These were the gatekeepers of her specific social circle. They traded local gossip over plates of seared tuna salad and tall glasses of iced tea. Evelyn understood the rules of this specific world better than anyone else at the club. In this elite enclave, reputation functioned as the primary currency. A family could survive a temporary financial downturn, but they could never survive a public scandal. Evelyn had spent 4 decades carefully curating her image as the perfect matriarch. She married Richard because he offered the exact aesthetic she desired. She viewed her children as direct extensions of her social portfolio. Harrison was her trophy. He provided the beautiful wife, the photogenic grandchildren, and the illusion of a thriving entrepreneurial career. Bonita, on the other hand, represented a utilitarian asset. Bonita possessed immense wealth and stability, but lacked the traditional domestic optics Evelyn valued. When Harrison began to spiral downward under the weight of his hidden debts, Evelyn did not hesitate to sacrifice her daughter to protect her son. She had drained her own retirement accounts to cover the immediate gift taxes. She knew she was currently destitute on paper. If these women sitting across from her discovered her bank balance was near zero, she would be exiled from this patio by sunset. The conversation naturally drifted toward local real estate. A woman named Patricia leaned forward, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. Patricia mentioned seeing heavy demolition contractors parked outside the Brown estate earlier that morning. The question hung in the humid air, requiring an immediate and calculated response. Evelyn knew she had to take control of the narrative before the rumors could fester and mutate. She let out a soft, rehearsed sigh. She placed her right hand over her heart, projecting the image of a weary but endlessly devoted mother. She announced to the table that she and Richard were gifting the entire property to Harrison. The other women exchanged subtle glances, calculating the immense value of such a sudden property transfer. Patricia asked how Benita felt about the arrangement. This was the exact opening Evelyn needed to construct her defense. She needed to preemptively justify the highly uneven distribution of family assets. She began to assassinate her daughter's character using polite, razor-sharp language. She tilted her head and offered a sad, sympathetic smile. She told the table that Benita was a brilliant financial mind, but severely lacking in basic familial warmth. Evelyn described her daughter as a rigid, career-obsessed spinster who cared far more about mutual funds than her own flesh and blood. She painted a vivid picture of a wealthy sister who selfishly refused to assist her struggling brother during a brief rough patch. Evelyn spun the lie with effortless grace. She framed herself and Richard as the benevolent saviors stepping in to correct a tragic lack of sibling loyalty. By cornering Benita in this specific social narrative, Evelyn laid a brilliant public relations trap. If Benita ever complained about the house transfer to anyone in their circle, she would instantly fulfill the exact stereotype her mother just created. Any display of anger from Benita would merely confirm the rumor that she was bitter and unyielding. The trap was firmly locked. The women at the table nodded in sympathetic unison, murmuring their approval of Evelyn and her maternal sacrifice. Evelyn reached for her tall, crystal glass of iced tea. She picked up a long silver spoon to stir the melting ice cubes. As the metal clinked against the crystal, her right hand began to tremble. The slight, involuntary shake sent a ripple across the surface of the amber liquid. It was a microscopic crack in her flawless facade. The tremor betrayed the deep, repressed terror brewing just beneath her ribs. She was sitting in a luxury country club, spinning lies about her daughter, while her own signature sat on a forged government document. The reality of the federal felony she committed with Richard threatened to claw its way up her throat. She gripped the glass tighter, forcing her hand to remain still. She took a slow sip, letting the cold tea numb her nerves. Patricia praised Evelyn for handling such a complex family transition with remarkable poise. Evelyn placed her glass down and leaned back in her wrought iron chair. She boasted about the sheer efficiency of the legal process. She told her peers the title transfer was pristine and ready to close. She claimed she had hired the best title agents in the city to ensure a seamless, flawless transition. She smiled beneath her dark sunglasses, feeling a temporary surge of artificial confidence. She bragged that her plan was ironclad, and nothing could possibly disrupt the closing scheduled for the following week. She was a woman proudly detailing the architecture of a bridge she did not know was rigged to explode. Any observer aware of the truth would revel in the sheer dramatic irony of her arrogant boasting. Evelyn was actively digging her own financial grave, using a fabricated trust revocation as the shovel. She believed she had outsmarted a dead man. She thought she had outmaneuvered her intelligent, calculating daughter. She sat in the sunshine, savoring her perceived victory, entirely unaware that the original, unmodified trust addendum was resting inside a grandfather clock, just waiting to detonate her entire existence. A sharp digital ringtone interrupted the quiet chatter at the table. Evelyn opened her designer leather handbag and retrieved her smartphone. The caller identification displayed the name of the lead closing agent at the commercial title company. A brief flash of annoyance crossed her features. She excused herself from the table, offering a polite nod to Patricia. She stood up and walked toward the edge of the patio, seeking a quiet corner near a row of tall, sculpted hedges. She answered the call, expecting a routine request for a secondary signature or a simple clarification on the property tax escrow. The voice on the other end of the line did not offer standard pleasantries. The closing agent sounded frantic and deeply stressed. He informed Evelyn that they had encountered a sudden, unexpected delay in the deed preparation. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. She demanded to know the exact nature of the problem. She reminded the agent that she was paying a premium fee for an expedited closing. The agent rushed to explain the severe complication. He told her a loud, flashy probate attorney had just marched into the county courthouse and filed an emergency legal injunction against the Coral Gables property. Evelyn gripped her phone tight enough to turn her knuckles white. The agent explained that the injunction cited standard emotional distress and unfair distribution claims on behalf of Bonita. The legal filing placed a temporary freeze on the title transfer. The closing could not proceed until the injunction was formally addressed and dissolved by a judge. Evelyn closed her eyes and let out a harsh, measured breath. She assumed this was a pathetic, desperate move by Bonita to throw a standard legal tantrum. She viewed the flashy probate lawyer as a mere nuisance, a minor roadblock on her path to total victory. She told the agent she would handle the situation and ended the call. She stood by the hedges, staring out at the manicured golf course. She convinced herself the injunction was just noise. She believed Bonita was fighting a visible, conventional war, using loud attorneys and standard complaints. Evelyn had no idea that the probate lawyer was nothing more than a brilliant tactical diversion. She did not realize Bonita was leading her into a shadow war, distracting her with a fake threat while setting the real trap. Evelyn smoothed her linen dress, lifted her chin, and walked back to her wealthy friends, ready to fight a battle she had already lost. Misdirection remains the fundamental principle of any successful stage illusion. The magician waves a brightly colored silk handkerchief in the air, drawing the eye of the audience, while his other hand quietly manipulates the hidden mechanics of the trick. I applied this exact philosophy to my current familial warfare. My mother and my sister-in-law possessed sharp, calculating minds. If I remained silent during the days leading up to the real estate closing, their natural paranoia would eventually ignite. They would start searching for hidden traps in the paperwork. I needed to provide them with a visible, noisy target to attack. I needed to feed their inherent arrogance and keep them distracted. I utilized a secure connection to retain the services of a local litigator named Julian Cross. Julian operated far outside the discreet, polished circles of high finance. He was a theatrical courtroom brawler whose face adorned highway billboards across the county. He favored tailored pinstripe suits, loud press conferences, and relentless posturing. He represented the exact opposite of the silent, dignified power my family respected. He was the perfect, loud distraction to keep their eyes off my true objective. I instructed Julian to draft the most obnoxious cease and desist notice his paralegals could construct. The legal petition cited profound emotional distress, inequitable asset distribution, and potential elder manipulation. Legally speaking, the document was a flimsy house of cards. Any competent judge would review the petition and toss it out of the courtroom within a single week. Securing a victory before a judge was never my actual goal. I needed to buy precious time and force my adversaries to exhaust their focus on a phantom enemy. A private courier delivered the thick legal packet to my brother-rented townhouse early the next morning. Naomi received the heavy parcel while standing in her pristine, stainless steel kitchen. The air smelled of freshly brewed espresso and expensive citrus cleaning spray. The manila envelope featured bright red urgent stamps slapped across the front cover. When she tore open the thick paper flap and read the enclosed demands, a cold, furious smirk touched her lips. Naomi operated in the high-stakes realm of corporate compliance. She analyzed risk patterns and neutralized liabilities for a living. She reviewed the poorly constructed arguments printed on the page and immediately categorized my lawsuit as a desperate, flailing attempt to retain control. She viewed the injunction as the ultimate proof of my inherent weakness. She assumed I lacked the strategic intelligence to mount a legitimate defense and had resorted to hiring a billboard clown to throw a public tantrum. She walked over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting beneath her marble kitchen island. She fed the red stamped injunction straight into the metal teeth. The machine whirred loudly, devouring the legal threat and spitting it into tiny, meaningless ribbons of white paper. Naomi watched the destruction with profound satisfaction. She pulled out her smartphone and dialed her own expensive defense attorneys. She authorized her legal team to spend whatever capital was necessary to crush Julian Cross and dissolve the temporary hold placed on the property title. The shadow war functioned flawlessly. Naomi redirected all her ruthless energy toward fighting the visible conventional threat. She spent her precious hours drafting countermotions and coordinating legal strikes against my proxy lawyer. Her supreme confidence blinded her to the surrounding environment. While she focused intensely on the shiny red herring swimming right in front of her face, she failed to notice the silent, lethal trust trap Mr. Sterling and I were assembling in the dark depths below. She believed she was outsmarting an emotional spinster. She did not realize she was merely wrestling a shadow while the executioner sharpened the axe. The diversion provided the exact breathing room I required to investigate the true source of my brother's frantic midnight telephone call. I sat at my mahogany desk later that afternoon, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee. The secure internal messaging system on my dual monitors chimed softly. The notification originated from the Risk Assessment Division of my own wealth management firm. Earlier that week, I had submitted a discreet inquiry regarding the offshore syndicate hounding Harrison. I used my executive clearance to trace the shell companies listed on the commercial bridge loan application Naomi had filed with the county. I opened the encrypted digital dossier. The file contained dozens of pages detailing complex financial webs and subsidiary holdings. The syndicate operated under a generic corporate umbrella designed to obscure the true benefactors. They utilized predatory lending tactics, issuing high-interest loans to desperate individuals who could not secure traditional banking credit. When the borrowers inevitably defaulted, the syndicate seized their collateral with ruthless surgical efficiency. I scrolled past the initial executive summaries and focused on the parent company ownership structure. Tracing illicit debt networks resembled peeling back the layers of a toxic onion. Each layer revealed another dummy corporation registered in a different offshore tax haven. My eyes scanned the final flowchart, displaying the ultimate corporate entity pulling the strings at the top of the hierarchy. I set my coffee cup down. The porcelain clicked sharply against the wooden desk. The air in my office grew suddenly cold. The name listed at the apex of the organizational chart was not a shadowy foreign cartel or an anonymous local mobster. The parent company controlling the predatory lending syndicate was a familiar subsidiary acquisition. 2 years ago, my own wealth management firm had purchased this specific debt collection agency to diversify our high-yield distressed asset portfolio. As a senior partner holding significant equity in the firm, I effectively owned a fractional controlling interest in the subsidiary. I stared at the glowing monitor as the monumental revelation washed over me. I traced the lineage of the debt from the shell company directly back to my own corporate ledger. The numbers aligned perfectly. The capital Harrison had borrowed to cover his fraudulent venture schemes originated from a fund I helped manage. I was not just a discarded daughter fighting for a childhood home. I was the apex predator hunting my own sibling. The terrifying anonymous creditors threatening to bankrupt my brother, seize his vehicles, and forward his falsified revenue reports to the federal authorities were operating under my corporate umbrella. Harrison was weeping in the dark, terrified of a monster he could not see. He had no idea the monster was sitting in a corner office in downtown Miami, holding his entire financial existence in the palm of her hand. The strategic landscape had just shifted from a defensive posture to total omnipotent control. The glowing monitor illuminated the dim confines of my executive suite. I sat motionless, staring at the corporate dossier detailing the predatory lending syndicate. The intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts finally resolved into a single, undeniable truth. The parent organization listed at the apex of the organizational hierarchy was Meridian Asset Solutions. 2 years prior, my wealth management enterprise had acquired Meridian to diversify our high-yield distressed liability portfolio. As a senior partner with substantial equity, I held a fractional controlling interest in that specific subsidiary. I raised my right hand and traced the etched logo on the leather-bound folder resting beside my keyboard. The silver emblem felt cold beneath my fingertips. A slow, terrifying smile stretched across my face. The sheer poetic irony of the universe unfolded in front of my eyes. My sibling had spent his entire adult life running away from accountability. When he was 20, our father covered his wrecked sports car. When he turned 30, our mother liquidated a mutual fund to settle his underground poker losses. They conditioned him to believe a safety net would always materialize whenever he stepped off a financial cliff. But Richard and Evelyn possessed finite resources. When Harrison falsified his venture startup revenue reports and traditional banking institutions slammed their doors shut, he sought refuge in the shadow markets. He thought he was borrowing from anonymous loan sharks. He believed he was dealing with ruthless strangers who operated outside the boundaries of polite society. He never realized those shadow entities were merely specialized collection branches managed by corporate executives sitting in downtown Miami skyscrapers. The terrifying monster keeping my brother awake at night. The unseen predator threatening to seize his leased vehicles and forward his wire fraud evidence to federal prosecutors was not a faceless mobster. The monster was me. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, listening to the quiet hum of the climate control system. The strategic landscape fundamentally shifted beneath my feet. I no longer operated from a defensive posture, relying solely on Mr. Sterling and a hidden trust addendum. I now commanded total, omnipotent control over the entire battlefield. I held the key to the Coral Gables estate through my grandfather's restricted deed, and I literally owned my brother's suffocating debt. The power dynamic was intoxicating. I could instruct the subsidiary to forgive the loan, erasing his impending ruin with a single authorized signature. I could save him. But the memory of that tap water glass sliding across the dining table hardened my resolve. I remembered Naomi's condescending smirk as she paraded her architect through my childhood home. I recalled my mother spinning venomous lies at her country club luncheon, portraying me as a bitter spinster. They had chosen their path. I decided to ensure they reached their chosen destination faster than they anticipated. I picked up the secure desk phone and dialed the direct extension for David Thorne. David served as the primary managing director of Meridian Asset Solutions. He was a sharp, unsentimental operator who specialized in squeezing distressed debtors until they surrendered their final hidden assets. The line connected. David offered a crisp, professional greeting. He recognized my internal extension and asked how he could assist a senior partner this late in the afternoon. I bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries. I directed his attention to a specific delinquent file currently flagged in his system. I recited Harrison's full legal name and the corresponding offshore loan identification number. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard as David pulled the digital ledger onto his terminal. He confirmed the account status. He noted the borrower was severely delinquent and had requested a temporary extension, claiming an impending real estate transaction would generate sufficient liquidity to clear the balance. David explained his team was currently holding off on the asset seizure protocols, based on the promise of that upcoming title transfer. I instructed him to deny the extension request. The clicking on his end stopped. David asked for clarification, noting that pushing a desperate borrower too hard might force them into premature bankruptcy, shielding their assets behind a federal judge. I kept my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. I told David the borrower was utilizing a fabricated property deed to secure a bridge loan. I explained the real estate collateral was toxic and would evaporate the moment the title agents finalized their review. I ordered him to accelerate the collection timeline immediately. I outlined a precise psychological strike. I commanded David to authorize a collection team to tag the borrower leased luxury vehicles by tomorrow morning. I told him to send a formal intent to litigate notice directly to the venture startup registered corporate address, ensuring the other investors witnessed the legal threat. I wanted the pressure dialed up to an excruciating level. David remained silent for a brief moment, digesting the ruthless directive. He operated in a brutal industry, but senior partners rarely intervened to micromanage a single delinquent account. He agreed to execute the updated parameters and promised the collection protocols would initiate before sunrise. I disconnected the call and placed the receiver back into its cradle. The trap was now perfectly synchronized. If I allowed Harrison too much breathing room, he might find an alternative escape route. He might secure a different shadow loan or convince my parents to flee the state. I needed him backed into a corner so tight he had zero options remaining. He had to feel the crushing weight of imminent federal prosecution and total public humiliation. The intensified pressure would force him to demand an expedited closing on the Coral Gables estate. He would drag my parents to that glass conference table and coerce them into signing the forged quitclaim deed because it represented his only hallucinated lifeline. My directive guaranteed he would trigger my grandfather automatic reversion clause out of sheer blind panic. Naomi was currently wasting her formidable intellect fighting Julian Cross and his flashy red herring injunction. Evelyn was busy convincing her wealthy peers that her legacy was secure. Richard was polishing his golf clubs, believing he had rescued his golden boy. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, oblivious to the water rushing into the hull. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow sip of the cooling dark roast coffee. The bitter taste matched the cold satisfaction settling deep within my chest. I opened a new spreadsheet on my monitor, preparing to draft the eviction notices I would require next week. A sharp buzzing sound shattered the quiet tranquility of my suite. The internal intercom system connected directly to the lobby security desk flashed a bright red light. I pressed the silver communication button. The voice of Carlos, the evening security supervisor, crackled through the small speaker. He sounded uncharacteristically tense. Carlos apologized for the interruption, but stated we had a volatile situation unfolding near the primary elevator banks. He informed me an unauthorized visitor had bypassed the initial screening desk and was currently pacing erratically in the secure staging area. I asked for the identity of the trespasser. Carlos recited my brother's name. He described Harrison's physical state, noting the man was sweating profusely, breathing heavily, and refusing to leave the premises. Carlos warned me the visitor appeared deeply manic and was loudly demanding to speak with his sister regarding an urgent financial emergency. The Shadow Syndicate had clearly initiated the accelerated pressure campaign earlier than I anticipated. Harrison was drowning, and the rising water had chased him straight to my doorstep. He did not come to offer apologies or seek forgiveness. He came searching for a cash bailout from the very sibling he was actively attempting to defraud. I released the intercom button, staring at the glowing red light. The final act of the tragedy was marching up the elevator shaft, and I was perfectly prepared to welcome him inside. I pressed the silver communication button on my console and instructed Carlos to authorize the elevator override. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite slid open 3 minutes later. Harrison stumbled into the quiet reception area, breaking the serene atmosphere of the floor. The tailored Italian suit he wore to the celebratory dinner was gone. In its place, he wore a wrinkled linen shirt untucked at the waist and dark trousers covered in lint. His eyes were bloodshot and frantic, darting around the polished marble foyer like a trapped animal searching for an exit. The confident golden child aura had vanished. He looked like a drowning man grasping for a piece of floating debris. He bypassed my stunned administrative assistant and marched directly into my private office. I remained seated in my ergonomic chair, watching his chaotic approach. He reached my mahogany workspace and leaned forward, planting both hands on the polished surface to steady his trembling frame. His fingers shook with such severe intensity he clipped the edge of my ceramic mug. The vessel tipped over, spilling cold, dark roast coffee across the wood. The bitter liquid pooled around my keyboard and soaked into the edges of my financial spreadsheets. It was a stark visual representation of his entire existence bleeding into my ordered life. I did not flinch. I did not reach for a napkin to stop the spreading stain. I simply stared at the ruined documents and then shifted my gaze up to meet his terrified eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked in the middle of a syllable. He swallowed hard, attempting to summon the arrogant charm our mother had nurtured for decades. The charm failed to materialize. Instead, a pathetic, desperate plea spilled from his lips. He begged me to call off Julian Cross. He pleaded with me to drop the probate injunction and let the title company process the real estate transfer without any further delay. He reached into his wrinkled shirt pocket and retrieved a folded piece of paper. He smoothed the creased document flat against a dry corner of the desk. It was a standard title clearance waiver, drafted by the attorneys Naomi kept on retainer. He explained that if I signed this single page, relinquishing any future claims to the Coral Gables property, the commercial lender would ignore the injunction and fund the bridge loan by Friday morning. He slid a sleek metallic pen across the wood, urging me to endorse my own surrender. To secure my compliance, he pivoted toward emotional manipulation. He weaponized our shared history, digging up buried fragments of childhood nostalgia. He reminded me of a summer afternoon when we were adolescents, hiding in the branches of the ancient banyan tree in our backyard. He recounted a specific day he took the blame for a broken garage window, shielding me from our father's strict discipline. He framed his current crisis as a minor stumble, asking me to return that decades-old favor. He called me his protector, his older sister, his only remaining ally in a cold, unforgiving world. I sat motionless, listening to his desperate performance. A fleeting sliver of pity pierced the icy armor guarding my chest. I looked at his sunken cheeks and the dark purple circles bruising the fragile skin beneath his eyes. Beneath the fraud and the staggering gambling debts, he was still the little boy who used to hold my hand during severe tropical thunderstorms. I possessed the unilateral authority to end his nightmare today. I could sign the waiver, cancel the Meridian collection protocols, and let him walk away with the extracted equity. I held his salvation at the tip of the metallic pen resting near my fingertip. But my memory proved far stronger than my temporary pity. The image of the banyan tree dissolved, replaced by the vivid recollection of the recent family dinner. I remembered the heavy crystal pitcher and the condensation-beaded glass of tap water my mother slid toward my plate. I recalled the sound of Naomi's expensive heels clicking against the terracotta tiles as she paraded her architect through the foyer, patronizing my solitary existence. I thought about the forged trust revocation bearing my dead grandfather's signature sitting inside a government filing cabinet. They had not treated me like a sister or an ally. They treated me like a disposable utility, a temporary obstacle standing between them and their unearned fortune. Harrison was not begging for my forgiveness or attempting to mend our fractured relationship. He was begging for my blind compliance. If I rescued him today, he would continue his reckless descent, draining my parents dry until nothing remained but dust and profound regret. I reached across the desk and picked up the folded waiver. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the arrogant assumption that I would fold under pressure. I read the printed text, scanning the blatantly illegal indemnity clause, designed to strip away my inheritance rights. I did not uncap the pen. I held the document with both hands, placing my thumbs near the top edge. I looked my brother dead in the eye and applied a slow, deliberate pressure. The thick parchment ripped down the center. The crisp tearing sound echoed sharply in the quiet office. I placed the two severed halves precisely on top of each other and tore them again, quartering the legal contract. I released my grip, letting the ruined pieces flutter down onto the mahogany desk. They landed directly in the puddle of spilled coffee, soaking up the dark liquid until the printed words blurred into illegible ink stains. Harrison stared at the destroyed waiver, his jaw hanging slack. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen, sickly pallor. The realization of my refusal struck him like a physical blow to the sternum. He staggered backward, stumbling against a leather guest chair. His shock rapidly mutated into a blind, chaotic rage. He raised his hands, pulling at his own hair and pacing the length of my office like a cornered predator, realizing the cage door just swung shut. His voice escalated into a frantic, hysterical scream. He accused me of harboring a lifelong jealousy regarding his status in the family. He shouted that I was destroying the only blood relatives we had left out of sheer bitter spite. He claimed our parents would never forgive my betrayal and swore I would die alone, surrounded by nothing but cold bank accounts and empty rooms. He hurled every toxic insult he could conjure, trying to inflict the same agonizing pain he was currently experiencing. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin as he unleashed a decade of repressed resentment. I remained silent, absorbing his venom without offering a single word of defense. I let him empty his lungs. I allowed him to burn his remaining energy on a futile tantrum. When his screams eventually devolved into ragged, exhausted pants, he turned his back on me. He stormed toward the heavy glass doors, kicking the metal frame as he exited my suite. The loud crash reverberated down the hallway, signaling his chaotic departure. I watched the elevator doors slide shut, swallowing his retreating figure. He believed he was walking away from a cruel, unyielding sibling. He thought my refusal to sign the clearance waiver was the ultimate source of his destruction. He remained entirely oblivious to the true architecture of his impending doom. By tearing that document into pieces, I ensured the commercial title agents would refuse to close the bridge loan early. I guaranteed the timeline would remain agonizingly strict. My rejection left him with zero alternative options. He could no longer rely on a shortcut or a quiet settlement. The Meridian collection agents would arrive at his townhouse by dawn, tagging his vehicles and serving his legal notices. The crushing weight of the Shadow Syndicate would force his hand, pushing him past the brink of rational thought. To appease his imaginary creditors and secure the phantom equity, he would have no choice but to attend the formal real estate closing scheduled for Friday morning. He would drag my mother and father into that sterile conference room, demanding they execute the forged quitclaim deed because it represented his singular, hallucinated lifeline. He stormed out of my office, believing I had ruined his escape route, unaware I had just locked the final deadbolt on his execution chamber. I pulled a fresh microfiber cloth from my lower drawer and began wiping the spilled coffee off my keyboard. The bitter liquid soaked into the fabric, leaving my workspace clean and ordered once again. I disposed of the ruined waiver in the wastebasket beneath my feet. The stage was set. The actors were positioned in their final marks. All that remained was the gathering around the glass table where the truth would finally break the silence. Thursday evening brought a heavy, suffocating heat to the Florida coast. The sky above Coral Gables bruised a deep shade of violet, threatening a late summer downpour that never quite materialized. I sat in my downtown office when a terse text message illuminated my phone screen. My mother demanded my immediate presence at the estate. She classified the gathering as a mandatory family intervention. I knew precisely what awaited me inside those walls. Harrison had scurried back to the nest, bruised and terrified, spinning a frantic narrative of my cruelty. He had undoubtedly told them about the torn waiver and the spilled coffee, painting himself as the victim of a jealous older sister. I packed my briefcase, turned off my monitors, and drove south into the gathering storm. I parked my vehicle on the crushed white gravel. The humidity clung to my skin like a damp shroud as I ascended the front steps. I used my original brass key to unlock the heavy oak door, stepping into the dim foyer. The primary source of illumination poured from the formal dining room archway, casting long, distorted shadows across the terracotta floor tiles. Before stepping into the light, I paused in the hallway corner. A tall wooden grandfather clock stood against the floral wallpaper. Its heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking with a fierce, unrelenting rhythm. I glanced at my wristwatch. The antique timepiece ran exactly 3 minutes slow. It had operated on that delayed schedule since the day my grandfather died. My parents never bothered to hire a horologist to calibrate the gears. They ignored the slight imperfection, entirely oblivious to the sealed wax envelope resting safely inside the hollow wooden belly. I pressed my palm against the polished mahogany casing for a brief second, drawing quiet strength from the hidden armory. Then I turned and walked into the dining room. The atmosphere felt thick, charged with an oppressive, frantic desperation. My parents sat together at the head of the long mahogany table. Harrison sat to their left, staring intently at his cuticles. He looked hollowed out, depleted by the events of the afternoon. His frantic energy had burned away, leaving only a fragile, trembling shell. Naomi stood near the antique credenza, with her arms crossed tightly over her silk blouse. Her posture remained rigid, projecting the flawless image of an outraged, supportive spouse. Evelyn initiated the assault without a standard greeting. She did not offer me a seat or a glass of water. She stood up, planting her manicured hands flat on the polished wood. She accused me of orchestrating a vindictive legal campaign designed to destroy my own brother. She demanded I contact Julian Cross and withdraw the probate injunction immediately. She framed my actions as a shameful public embarrassment, claiming I was dragging our pristine family name through the mud out of pure, unadulterated spite. Her voice trembled, carrying the frantic edge of a woman who knew her bank accounts were hovering near zero. My father took over, silencing my mother with a raised hand. Richard Brown was a man who inherited his social standing and spent his entire adult life pretending he earned it through hard work. He possessed a country club membership, but lacked the grueling discipline required to build an actual empire. He secretly resented my financial independence because my success highlighted his own fiscal incompetence. He looked at me with cold, unvarnished disdain. The polite paternal facade he maintained for decades finally cracked, fracturing into pieces and revealing the ugly truth resting beneath his tailored suits. Richard delivered a psychological strike explicitly designed to break my spirit. He told me I fundamentally misunderstood my role within the family ecosystem. He pointed a steady finger at Harrison, declaring his son as the true legacy of our bloodline. He said Harrison carried the family name, provided the beautiful grandchildren, and represented the only viable future for their heritage. Then his eyes locked onto mine. He lowered his voice, delivering the cruelest assessment a parent could utter. He called me a sterile utility. He stated I was nothing more than a bank account, a convenient financial mechanism meant to facilitate the success of the true heirs. He claimed my refusal to sign the title clearance waiver proved I possessed a barren, unlovable heart, incapable of genuine loyalty. He wanted to see me crumble. He expected tears, a trembling lip, or a raised voice begging for his approval. I offered him none of those predictable reactions. I stood at the opposite end of the table and focused my gaze on the intricate grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. I slowed my heart rate, concentrating on the faint scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. I let the venom wash over me without allowing a single drop to penetrate my skin. The seasoned wealth manager inside my mind analyzed his cruel outburst as a final, desperate negotiation tactic. He was attempting to crush my leverage by annihilating my self-esteem. It was a strategy built on weakness, not strength. I looked up from the table. I met my father's cold stare with an expression of terrifying stillness. The silence stretched for several long seconds, forcing him to shift his weight uncomfortably. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone, entirely devoid of emotion. I told him he did not need to worry about Julian Cross or the probate injunction. I promised I would contact the attorney and withdraw the legal filing first thing in the morning, clearing the path for the commercial title agents. Harrison let out a loud, ragged sigh of relief, slumping forward in his dining chair like a puppet with cut strings. Evelyn closed her eyes, murmuring a quiet word of thanks to an unseen deity. Naomi uncrossed her arms, a triumphant smirk blooming across her face. They believed they had won. They thought their coordinated psychological warfare had successfully forced my submission. I offered them one final guarantee to seal the illusion. I promised I would attend the closing meeting tomorrow morning to ensure the property title transferred exactly as Grandfather Thomas intended. I did not wait for a response or a hollow expression of gratitude. I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to celebrate their false victory. The hallway felt cooler, detached from the suffocating heat of their desperation. As I moved toward the front door, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows near the study. Naomi had slipped out of the dining room through the secondary kitchen door, bypassing the main corridor. She stood in the dark corner, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of her mobile device. She was typing a message with rapid, frantic precision. I did not need to see the screen to know who she was contacting. She was texting her predatory lenders, confirming the trap was primed. I watched her hit send, securing the collateral for a 10 o'clock appointment, blissfully unaware she had just scheduled her own execution. Friday morning arrived with a blinding white glare reflecting off the steel and glass facades of the downtown Miami skyscrapers. The executive suite of the commercial title agency felt like a refrigerated vault. The climate control system hummed a steady, low-frequency drone, holding the room at a crisp 68 degrees. I sat perfectly still at the far edge of a broad, transparent conference table. The polished glass surface offered no place to hide. Every crossed leg, every tapping foot, every nervous twitch remained visible to anyone who cared to look. We had circled back to the precise moment my story began. The young closing attorney stood at the head of the table. He wore a sharp navy suit and possessed the eager, untroubled demeanor of a man who handled routine real estate transactions for a living. He harbored no concept of the invisible poison dripping from the documents he was currently organizing into neat chronological stacks. He straightened the edges of the thick paper bundles, tapping them against the glass with a sharp, rhythmic thud. His innocence provided a stark contrast to the criminal conspiracy unfolding right in front of his eyes. Harrison sat directly across from me. He looked like a prisoner who had just received a midnight pardon. The frantic, manic terror that fueled his intrusion into my office the previous afternoon had evaporated. A profound, desperate relief washed over his features, smoothing the harsh lines around his mouth. He wiped a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead using a folded linen handkerchief. His right leg bounced beneath the table with a rapid, restless energy vibrating against the metal table frame. He had spent the last month dodging phone calls from shadow lenders and jumping at every unexpected shadow. Now he believed he had finally secured his salvation. When the young attorney placed the first stack of papers near the center of the table, Harrison leaned forward. The sudden shift in his weight caused his expensive leather chair to emit a sharp, high-pitched squeak. The sound pierced the quiet room like a warning siren. He reached out to grab the silver closing pen resting near the documents. He handled the writing instrument with eager reverence, entirely unaware that he was wrapping his fingers around the handle of a guillotine. Naomi sat beside her husband, radiating a cold, victorious glow. She had selected a flawless white blazer for the occasion, projecting the aura of a woman who conquered every obstacle placed in her path. She kept her posture impeccably straight, resting her designer handbag on the empty chair beside her. She grew up in a rigid household where financial failure was treated as a moral sin. She spent her entire adult life clawing her way up the corporate ladder, building an impenetrable fortress of wealth and status. She believed she had outmaneuvered a formidable shadow syndicate. She thought she had successfully manipulated my parents into liquidating their entire future to serve her immediate needs. She threw a brief, patronizing glance in my direction, expecting to see a defeated sibling mourning the loss of a childhood home. I met her gaze with a blank, unreadable expression, yielding nothing. Richard and Evelyn Brown occupied the seats to my left. My parents looked profoundly exhausted. The physical toll of draining their retirement accounts and betraying their eldest daughter manifested in the dark hollows beneath their eyes. The impeccable country club vitality they normally projected had worn dangerously thin. Their skin possessed a grayish pallor, and their hands shook slightly when they reached for their respective coffee cups. Yet despite their visible fatigue, they clung to a manufactured sense of parental pride. They squared their shoulders and offered each other tight, reassuring smiles. They convinced themselves this sacrifice was a noble endeavor. They believed they were securing a prestigious legacy for their bloodline. The younger attorney cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the room. He explained the sequence of the morning proceedings in a brisk, professional tone. He noted that the transaction involved a complex web of simultaneous transfers to satisfy the requirements of the commercial bridge lender. The lender required Harrison to execute the financial promissory notes before the property title officially changed hands. The lawyer spoke with practiced efficiency, oblivious to the tension suffocating the clients sitting around his table. He slid a thick, bound stack of financial contracts toward my brother. These were the debt instruments Naomi had negotiated to pay off the offshore syndicate. The documents outlined steep interest rates and strict repayment penalties. Harrison did not bother reading the fine print. He uncreased the first page, uncapped the silver pen, and began signing his name with rapid, sweeping strokes. The friction of the metal nib scratching against the heavy parchment filled the quiet room. Each signature bound him tighter to the predatory loan. He signed 10 separate pages, sealing his financial fate with a desperate, eager smile. He thought he was buying his freedom. In reality, he was locking the door to his own financial prison cell. When the final promissory note was endorsed, the attorney collected the bundle and set it aside. He reached for a single crisp sheet of paper resting at the bottom of his leather portfolio. He placed the document in the center of the glass table, orienting the text so my parents could read the bold heading printed across the top margin. It was the quit-claim deed. This singular page represented the culmination of their betrayal. This was the instrument required to formally renounce their rights to the Coral Gables estate and transfer the property free and clear to their son. The attorney smoothed the paper flat and looked directly at my father. He asked Richard if he understood the gravity of the document. He warned him that once the deed was signed and recorded, the transfer became final and irrevocable. My father did not hesitate. He did not look at me. He nodded his head, projecting a false, unwavering certainty. He stated it was time for Harrison to have a real home because he provided a real family. He repeated the exact cruel phrase he used during that terrible dinner 3 weeks ago. He reached for the silver pen and pressed the tip to the signature line. I watched the dark blue ink flow from the nib, soaking into the fibers of the paper. My father signed his full legal name, loops and sharp angles, carving his surrender into the public record. He slid the document toward my mother. Evelyn picked up the pen. Her hand trembled for a fraction of a second, a microscopic echo of the fear she felt at the country club patio. But her blind devotion overpowered her lingering guilt. She signed her name right next to his, formally extinguishing her own life tenancy. The deed was executed. The forged trust revocation resting in the county archives had cleared the path for this exact moment. The ink dried on the thick paper, shimmering slightly under the fluorescent lights. My parents exhaled in unison, sinking back into their leather chairs. They had done it. They had sacrificed their own security and my rightful inheritance to save the golden child. Harrison let out a breathless laugh, reaching over to squeeze Naomi's hand. Naomi offered a tight, triumphant nod. They were mere seconds away from walking out of that suite with millions of dollars in extracted equity. The nightmare they had been running from appeared to be permanently solved. The young closing attorney smiled, offering a polite word of congratulations. He retrieved the signed quitclaim deed and placed it squarely on his leather blotting pad. He reached into his briefcase and produced a heavy metal notary stamp. This physical device held the power to legalize the transaction. Once the raised seal indented the paper, the deed would be instantly transmitted to the county clerk, finalizing the transfer of ownership. The room grew painfully silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. I sat at the far edge of the glass table, keeping my breathing slow and even. The trap was fully primed. The signatures were locked onto the page. The fraudulent condition required to trigger my grandfather's automatic reversion clause had just been fulfilled in front of sworn witnesses. My parents had officially attempted to bypass the succession line. The attorney hovered the heavy metal stamp above the drying ink. He aligned the rectangular base, preparing to press down with his full weight. He closed his hand around the wooden handle, taking a final breath before stamping the page. Just as his wrist tensed to deliver the final strike, the heavy oak door of the conference room swung open with a loud, forceful click. The young attorney paused, his arm frozen in midair. Harrison whipped his head around, his breathless laugh dying in his throat. Naomi stiffened her triumphant smile, vanishing instantly. My parents turned their exhausted faces toward the entrance, their eyes widening in sudden confusion. Mr. Sterling stepped across the threshold. The retired estate attorney wore a dark, solemn suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase in his right hand. He walked into the sterile, refrigerated room, carrying the weight of a dead man broken promise, and he looked directly at me. Mr. Sterling closed the heavy oak door behind him. The loud click severed the conference room from the outside world. He did not ask for permission to enter, nor did he offer a polite apology for the sudden intrusion. He walked directly toward the head of the glass table, projecting the quiet authority of a man who held the final verdict in his hands. He looked at the young closing attorney, holding the metal notary stamp, and issued a single, calm directive. He told the young man to put the stamp down immediately. Richard stood up so fast, his leather chair scraped harshly against the industrial carpet. He demanded to know the meaning of this interruption. A flush of indignant red crept up his neck. He recognized my grandfather, old lawyer, but could not fathom why the retired man was standing in a downtown title agency interrupting a transaction that was mere seconds from completion. My father tried to summon his familiar country club bravado, claiming this was a private family matter and ordering the older man to leave the premises. Mr. Sterling ignored my father. He bypassed Richard and addressed the young attorney directly. He introduced himself as the sole executor of the Thomas Brown Revocable Trust. He stated that the property currently under review remained subject to the original strict covenants established by his late client. He advised the young lawyer that finalizing the current transaction would constitute a direct violation of trust law and implicate the title agency in a severe criminal conspiracy. The young attorney lowered his arm. The heavy metal base of the notary stamp clunked against the glass surface. He looked deeply confused, his professional confidence wavering under the intense scrutiny of the senior lawyer. He respectfully informed Mr. Sterling that the trust restrictions had been formally dissolved weeks ago. He gestured toward the digital file printout resting on his desk, citing the filed revocation document bearing my grandfather's signature. He explained the title search came back clear, and the bridge lender had authorized the closing based on that specific county filing. Mr. Sterling placed his worn leather briefcase on the floor. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his solemn dark suit and retrieved a thick, aged envelope. The paper was stiff, coated in a thin layer of fine dust gathered from 7 years hidden inside the hollow wooden casing of the hallway grandfather clock. He set the envelope flat on the transparent table surface, right next to the freshly signed quitclaim deed. A heavy red wax seal secured the flap. The customized emblem of my grandfather, Original Logistics Company, was pressed deeply into the hardened wax, serving as a silent testament to its authenticity. Mr. Sterling pressed his thumb under the aged flap and pushed upward. The crisp, sharp snap of the brittle wax breaking echoed through the refrigerated air. In the dead, silent room, the sudden sound cracked like a gunshot. It was the sound of a carefully constructed lie shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The noise made Harrison jump in his seat, his nervous energy spiking back to a fever pitch. Naomi narrowed her eyes, calculating the sudden shift in the room dynamic. The retired lawyer extracted a folded parchment document from the torn envelope. He did not hand it to my father. He extended his arm and presented the original unredacted Schedule B addendum directly to the young closing attorney. He instructed the young man to review the authentic signature of the date and the original embossed notary seal pressed into the bottom corner. He then told the young lawyer to compare those physical markers against the digital printout of the trust revocation my father had submitted to the county clerk. The young attorney picked up the aged parchment. His eyes scanned the dense text, darting back and forth between the original addendum and the revocation file. I watched his mind process the conflicting data. The dates did not align. The authentic signature possessed a fluid, unhesitating stroke, while the signature on the revocation appeared rigid and traced. The young lawyer realized he was standing in the middle of an active fraud scheme. He was mere seconds away from stamping a fabricated property transfer that would have cost his agency millions of dollars in liability. The blood drained from the young man's face, leaving him pale and shaken. He dropped the fake revocation file onto the glass table as if the paper were burning his fingers. He took 2 large steps backward, distancing himself from the quitclaim deed and the metal notary stamp. He looked at my father with a mixture of profound shock and rising professional anger. He announced in a trembling voice that his agency could not proceed with the closing. He stated the transaction was halted, pending a full legal investigation into the conflicting deeds. Naomi leaned forward, her flawless white blazer wrinkling at the elbows. Her cold, victorious glow vanished, replaced by a fierce, tactical urgency. She demanded to know what the old piece of paper said. She tried to assert her corporate dominance, insisting they possessed a binding bridge loan waiting for immediate funding. She warned the young attorney that delaying the closing would result in catastrophic financial damages and threatened to hold his title agency liable for the fallout. She refused to accept that her meticulously planned extraction was failing at the final hurdle. Mr. Sterling pulled a pair of silver reading glasses from his breast pocket and slid them onto his nose. He ignored Naomi's empty threats. He picked up the original addendum and began to read the archaic legalese aloud. His gravelly voice filled the sterile room, reciting the dense terminology my grandfather had weaponized 7 years ago. He articulated the specific clauses detailing the conditional reversionary interest. He read the exact sentence specifying that any deceptive attempt to bypass the designated succession line or alter the life tenancy without the explicit consent of the primary remainder beneficiary would result in immediate total forfeiture. He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses. He defined the primary remainder beneficiary for the room. He read my full legal name, Bonita Evelyn Brown. My mother gasped. She reached a shaking hand up to cover her mouth, her manicured nails digging into her own cheek. Her eyes darted from Mr. Sterling to me and back again. The polished country club matriarch realized she had walked blindfolded into a lethal trap. She finally understood why I sat so quietly at the edge of the table. She recognized that I had known about the forgery the entire time, and I had allowed her to proceed toward her own destruction. Mr. Sterling turned his attention directly to my father. He translated the dense legal phrasing into brutal, undeniable reality. He explained that Richard and Evelyn held a life estate. They possessed the right to reside in the home until their passing, but they never possessed the right to transfer the title. By submitting a forged revocation to the county clerk, they violated the foundational covenant of their tenancy. However, the ultimate penalty did not activate upon the forgery alone. The penalty required a formal, executed attempt to transfer the stolen deed. The retired lawyer pointed a long, weathered finger at the quitclaim deed, resting on the leather blotting pad. He noted the dark blue ink still shining under the fluorescent lights. He stated that by signing their names to that specific document in front of sworn witnesses, my parents had executed the forbidden transfer. They had pulled the trigger themselves. Their signatures did not give the house to Harrison. Their signatures legally voided their own ownership and vested the entire estate directly into my hands. Harrison sat frozen in his squeaking leather chair. He was a man who skimmed contracts and signed wherever his wife pointed. The archaic legal terminology bounced off his panicked mind, leaving him grasping for comprehension. He only knew the young attorney had backed away from the table and the notary stamp remained unused. The lifeline he desperately needed to appease the shadow syndicate was evaporating before his eyes. He looked at Naomi, seeking a translation, but his wife was staring at the original addendum with a look of pure, freezing horror. The silence stretched tight enough to snap. Harrison dropped his silver closing pen. It clattered loudly against the glass table, rolling toward the center, until it bumped against the rejected quitclaim deed. His hands began to shake with renewed, terrifying intensity. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor. His voice cracked, fracturing into a high-pitched, desperate plea. He demanded to know what the legal jargon meant, and begged someone to explain why the closing had stopped. Mr. Sterling looked down at my brother with a gaze devoid of any pity. He did not raise his voice. He delivered the translation of the archaic legal jargon with the cold precision of a surgeon making a final cut. He informed Harrison that the dense paragraphs printed on the original addendum meant the quitclaim deed resting on the table possessed zero transferring power. My parents lacked the legal capacity to give the estate away. The retired attorney pointed to the dark blue signatures shining on the paper. He explained that, by executing that specific document in front of the closing agent, Richard and Evelyn had triggered a dormant security measure. They had effectively evicted themselves. Their signatures instantly voided their own life tenancy. The property bypassed them, skipping over their generation entirely, and vested 100% in my name. They had inadvertently made me the sole, unencumbered owner of the Coral Gables estate. They were no longer the masters of the house. They were now my tenants. My mother let out a shallow, ragged breath. She leaned forward, her hands trembling so severely she could no longer support her own weight. The designer reading glasses perched near the edge of her nose slipped forward. They fell onto the hard, transparent surface of the conference table. The delicate lenses shattered upon impact, sending tiny crystalline splinters skittering across the smooth glass. The sharp cracking sound mirrored the destruction of her carefully curated reality. She stared at the broken frames, unable to process the magnitude of her own fatal error. Her country club kingdom had just collapsed into dust. Richard sat paralyzed. The fake empire he spent his adult life projecting vanished in a single heartbeat. He realized he had drained his entire retirement savings, paying exorbitant gift taxes for a transaction that just stripped him of his only remaining asset. He was destitute, and he had engineered his own ruin. Harrison stared at the shattered lenses, and then turned his frantic gaze toward the young closing attorney. He begged the man to find a loophole. He pleaded for a way to reverse the signatures or cancel the deed submission. The young lawyer shook his head, stepping further away from the table. He stated his agency could not ensure a fraudulent transaction. He declared the bridge loan null and void. Without a clear, unencumbered title to use as collateral, the commercial lender would never release the funds. The phantom equity Harrison desperately needed to pay off his offshore debts evaporated into the cold, refrigerated air. The lifeline he hallucinated was severed. Naomi realized the terrifying implication before her husband did. The bridge loan was dead. The property belonged to me. The shadow syndicate demanded their money by the end of the week, and Harrison possessed zero remaining capital. She looked at the man she married, evaluating him not as a partner, but as a toxic liability. Her impeccable white blazer suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She was tethered to a sinking ship, and the dark water was rushing over the deck. I sat quietly at the far edge of the table, watching the devastation ripple through my family. I had absorbed their disrespect, their cruel dismissals, and their coordinated psychological warfare for a month. Now it was my turn to speak. I reached down and opened the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. I extracted the thick, encrypted dossier I had compiled the previous afternoon. I placed the heavy folder on the glass surface. I pushed it forward. The leather binding glided smoothly across the table, stopping directly in front of my brother. I instructed him to open it. Harrison looked at the folder as if it contained a coiled snake. His hands shook as he lifted the cover. He stared at the corporate logo printed across the first page. It was the emblem for Meridian Asset Solutions. He blinked his bloodshot eyes, failing to comprehend why his sister possessed the internal ledgers of his anonymous shadow lenders. I kept my voice even and calm, stripping away any trace of emotion. I explained the intricate structure of the predatory lending syndicate he had sought out. I detailed the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, and the generic umbrella organizations designed to hide the true benefactors. I watched his face as I revealed the final, devastating truth. I told him Meridian Asset Solutions was not a faceless foreign cartel. It was a subsidiary debt collection firm acquired by my own wealth management enterprise 2 years ago. I clarified my specific role within that enterprise. As a senior partner holding significant equity, I owned a fractional controlling interest in the subsidiary. The anonymous predators he had been running from the ruthless creditors threatening to ruin his life and forward his wire fraud evidence to federal prosecutors operated under my direct corporate authority. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The monster keeping him awake at night was sitting right across the table. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid the formal notice of default across the glass. I informed him that I had denied his request for a temporary extension. I told him I had authorized the collection division to initiate maximum pressure protocols early this morning. I looked at the sleek silver watch secured around my wrist and provided a real-time status update. I announced that a recovery team was currently standing in the driveway of his rented townhouse. They were hitching his leased luxury vehicles to flatbed tow trucks. I informed him his remaining banking accounts were frozen pending asset seizure. I stated that a formal intent to litigate notice had already been delivered to his venture startup headquarters, ensuring his other investors were currently reading about his falsified revenue reports. I foreclosed on his entire existence while he sat frozen in a squeaking leather chair. Naomi leaned over and read the notice of default. Her brilliant, calculating mind processed the flawless architecture of my trap. She realized her husband had not just made a poor financial decision, he had dragged her into a federal fraud scheme and lost the only leverage they possessed to a sibling he severely underestimated. She saw the frozen accounts, the impending public scandal, and the inevitable criminal charges looming on the horizon. The corporate strategist inside her initiated an immediate, ruthless damage control protocol. The familial alliance disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Naomi turned on Harrison with a fierce, unyielding disgust. She did not raise her voice to a scream. She lowered it to a venomous whisper, ensuring every syllable cut deep into his fragile ego. She called him a pathetic, incompetent parasite. She listed his failures, dismantling his golden child illusion piece by piece in front of his ruined parents. She stated she would not allow his reckless stupidity to destroy her professional licenses or tarnish her pristine corporate reputation. She reached for her left hand. She grasped the heavy diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band she had worn for 6 years. She pulled the jewelry off her finger with a swift, decisive motion. She tossed the rings onto the glass table. The precious metal and the cut gemstone clattered harshly against the transparent surface, coming to a rest directly on top of the voided quitclaim deed. Naomi picked up her designer handbag from the empty chair. She did not look at my mother or my father. She did not offer a single word of farewell to the man she just discarded. She turned on her heel and walked out of the conference room, the sharp click of her shoes echoing down the corridor as she abandoned the wreckage of the Brown family. Harrison sat motionless, staring at the abandoned diamond rings resting on his forged signature. The golden child was unmasked, exposed as a fraud, stripped of his marriage, his assets, and his false prestige. He had nothing left to leverage and nowhere left to run. My father buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, profound defeat. The patriarch who had coldly dismissed me as a sterile utility now relied entirely on my mercy for a roof over his head. Evelyn slowly lifted her head. The polished matriarch of the Coral Gables Country Club was gone. Her flawless makeup was ruined by a sudden flood of dark tears streaking down her pale cheeks. She looked at the shattered lenses of her reading glasses, and then she looked across the long glass table at me. The arrogant defiance she projected for decades had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She parted her trembling lips, preparing to beg for the mercy she never once offered me. My mother parted her trembling lips. The flawless facade she had spent 40 years constructing dissolved into a puddle of raw, unvarnished terror. The tears carving pathways through her expensive makeup were not born of remorse or maternal regret. They were the desperate tears of self-preservation. She looked at the empty chair where Naomi had sat moments before, and then she turned her weeping eyes back toward me. She reached a shaking hand across the transparent glass table, her fingers grasping at the empty air between us. She begged me to fix the situation. She pleaded with me to contact the debt collection agency and call off the hounds circling her son. She asked me to speak with Mr. Sterling and find a loophole to reverse the trust parameters. Her voice cracked into a high-pitched whine as she implored me to save Harrison from federal prison and public ruin. She used the word family over and over again, wielding the concept like a blunt instrument. She insisted that blood required forgiveness and demanded I rescue them from the very trap they had gleefully assembled for themselves. My father joined the chorus of despair. The proud country club patriarch whose arrogant sneer had dismissed me as a sterile utility just 24 hours ago was reduced to a hollow shell. Richard slumped forward in his squeaking leather chair. He did not ask for my forgiveness. His ego remained too fragile for genuine accountability. Instead, he asked for a financial loan. He begged me to advance him enough liquid capital from my own wealth management firm to repurchase a modest condominium. He cited his advancing age and failing health, hoping to extract a sliver of pity from the daughter he had tried to disinherit. Harrison said nothing. My brother remained entirely catatonic. He stared blankly at the dark blue ink of his signature on the voided quitclaim deed. The realization that he had engineered his own total destruction short-circuited his ability to speak or move. I sat at the far edge of the conference table and absorbed their weeping. A younger version of myself might have felt a twinge of guilt. A less disciplined woman might have yielded to the primal instinct to comfort her weeping mother. But the seasoned wealth manager sitting in that chair felt an incredible weightless clarity. I looked at the three people who had drained their life savings, committed felony forgery, and orchestrated a ruthless campaign of psychological abuse just to push me out of my own childhood home. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I felt nothing but profound, deep-seated peace. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket and met my mother's desperate gaze. I kept my voice quiet, clinical, and entirely devoid of emotion. I informed her that I possessed no legal authority to undo an irrevocable trust provision that she had intentionally triggered through an act of criminal forgery. I told my father I would not approve a personal loan from my firm because he had zero viable collateral and a documented history of severe fiscal mismanagement. I looked at my brother and stated the debt collection protocols would proceed exactly as scheduled. My mother let out a loud, ragged sob, covering her face with her hands. I reminded them of the exact phrasing they had weaponized against me during that terrible dinner 3 weeks ago. I kept my tone perfectly even, throwing their own cruel logic back into their laps. I noted that they wanted to prioritize Harrison because he provided a real family. I reminded my father of his declaration that Harrison represented the true legacy of our bloodline. I told them they had made their ultimate investment based on those specific beliefs. Now the market had closed, and they were forced to live with the returns they generated. I turned my attention to Mr. Sterling. The retired estate attorney stood near the heavy oak door, watching the resolution of my grandfather's legacy with solemn, quiet dignity. I instructed him to draft formal eviction notices for the Coral Gables property before the close of business. I directed him to grant the current occupants the standard 30 days to vacate the premises entirely. Richard gasped, clutching his chest as the reality of the eviction order struck him. He realized they were losing the estate, and they had no retirement savings left to secure alternative housing. A silver tray rested on a mahogany sideboard near the corner of the conference room. It held a bottle of vintage Cabernet and several crystal glasses. My father had brought the expensive wine to the title agency, intending to toast his successful theft once the notary stamp struck the page. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the heavy, dark bottle. I uncorked the vintage, pulling the stopper free with a soft pop. I poured a single generous measure into a crystal glass. The dark red liquid caught the bright fluorescent light, swirling with rich, complex hues. I picked up the glass and walked toward the exit. I passed behind my mother's chair. I looked down at the floor beneath the glass table. The shattered crystalline lenses of her designer reading glasses lay scattered across the industrial carpet, sparkling like crushed diamonds. I did not offer to help her pick up the broken pieces. I did not offer a final word of farewell. I simply stepped over the wreckage, opened the heavy oak door, and walked out of the suite, leaving them to drown in the shallow pool they had dug for themselves. A month passed. The wheels of justice turned with a slow, exacting poetry. The offshore syndicate functioning under my corporate subsidiary executed their recovery protocols with surgical precision. They seized my brother-leased luxury vehicles, dragging them out of his townhouse driveway on flatbed tow trucks in broad daylight. The federal authorities initiated a preliminary inquiry into his falsified venture startup revenue reports. The looming threat of criminal prosecution shattered whatever remained of his false prestige. Naomi did not linger to watch the ship sink. She finalized her divorce filings within 2 weeks, citing irreconcilable financial differences. She packed her belongings and relocated to a different state, severing all ties to the toxic ruin she had helped create. She preserved her corporate licenses and her pristine reputation, leaving Harrison to face the legal inferno alone. The fallout from my parents proved equally devastating. In the insular world of the Coral Gables elite, secrets hold very little shelf life. The news of the forged trust revocation and their sudden lack of liquid capital spread through the country club patios like wildfire. The same wealthy peers who had listened to my mother weave lies about my selfish nature quickly discovered the undeniable truth documented in public court filings. My parents were instantly ostracized, their memberships were quietly revoked, and their social invitations ceased entirely. The kingdom of status they valued above all else closed its gates forever. Destitute and facing an active eviction order, Richard and Evelyn Brown possessed 0 remaining options. They packed their remaining clothes and a few sentimental items into cardboard boxes. With no savings to rent a new condominium, they were forced to seek shelter with the only family member willing to open a door. They moved into Harrison-rented apartment. The justice delivered was exquisite in its specific cruelty. My parents had sacrificed everything to be closer to their son and his family. Now they share a cramped, chaotic 2-bedroom unit on the wrong side of the city. Harrison spends his days fighting federal subpoenas and dodging collection calls from my subsidiary agents. My father sleeps on a sagging sofa in the living room, while my mother navigates a tiny shared kitchen, mourning the loss of her Mediterranean estate. They received exactly what they asked for. They prioritized his family over my loyalty, and now they are permanently tethered to his relentless, suffocating ruin. Yesterday morning, I hired a private security contractor to change every deadbolt on the Coral Gables property. The heavy brass tumblers clicking into place sounded like a choir announcing the end of a long, grueling war. I stand on the second-floor master balcony this evening. The Florida sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of burnt orange and deep indigo. A warm, salty ocean breeze rolls through the courtyard, rustling the broad green fronds of the ancient palm trees. The air smells of blooming jasmine and undisturbed peace. I hold a fresh glass of vintage Cabernet, resting my elbows against the smooth stone railing. I look out over the sprawling, manicured grounds that Grandfather Thomas built with his own 2 hands. He designed this fortress to withstand hurricanes and human greed. He entrusted me with the keys because he knew I possessed the cold discipline required to lock the doors when the true storms arrived. I did not win my parents' love. I have accepted that unalterable fact. Some individuals are simply incapable of recognizing the value of a steady hand until they are already falling off the cliff. I no longer waste my energy mourning the affection they withheld. I traded the illusion of their love for the reality of my own freedom. I take a slow sip of the dark, rich wine. The taste is complex, carrying notes of aged oak and dark fruit. The heavy silence surrounding the estate is not empty or lonely. It is profound. It is the sound of a woman who stopped shrinking to fit into a family dynamic that required her endless sacrifice. I reclaimed my dignity, I secured my heritage, and I hold the deed free and clear. I watch the stars emerge in the darkening sky, standing alone in absolute, victorious silence. The architecture of a family, a reflection on the Brown estate. Families rarely shatter from a single explosive argument. They fracture quietly over decades through 1,000 small decisions about who matters, who is seen, and who is ultimately expendable. When we look back at the wreckage of the Brown family, a multi-million-dollar estate lost, a marriage dissolved, and aging parents banished to the cramped apartment of their ruined son, it is easy to focus on the cinematic climax of the forged deed and the hidden trust. But the true tragedy was not born in a lawyer's conference room. It was cultivated in the dining room, nurtured by a mother and father who fundamentally misunderstood the sacred assignment of parenting. In American culture, we often romanticize the traditional family structure. We place immense social value on the children who provide the perfect holiday photos, the spouses, the grandchildren, and the outward appearance of continuity. Richard and Evelyn Brown fell deep into this intoxicating trap. They looked at their son Harrison and saw a reflection of their own desired legacy. Because he possessed the traditional optics of success, a wife, children, a flashy startup, they blinded themselves to his profound lack of character. They abandoned the core parenting values of fairness and honesty for blind favoritism, transforming their golden child into a fragile, untouchable idol. True family responsibility requires the courage to see our children exactly as they are, not as the trophies we desperately wish them to be. When parents rush in to cushion every fall, to pay off every secret debt, and to cover up every lie, they are not protecting their child. They are financially and morally paralyzing them. By treating Harrison as an infallible prince simply because he provided the aesthetic of a family man, Richard and Evelyn robbed him of the opportunity to develop resilience. They taught him that his mistakes were always someone else's problem to solve. He became a man terrified of his own shadow, incapable of navigating the real world without a forged safety net. True love is not shielding a child from the consequences of their actions. True love is standing beside them with honesty as they face those consequences head-on. And what of the child who stands quietly in the background? Bonita represents the silent backbone of so many families. The dependable, responsible daughter who pays the property taxes, fixes the roof, and manages the crises without demanding applause. Emotional awareness in parenting demands that we see all our children equally, recognizing their unique strengths and vulnerabilities. Evelyn and Richard viewed Bonita's fierce independence as an excuse to neglect her emotional needs. They assumed that because she did not need their money, she did not need their respect or their affection. In a tragic perversion of parental duty, they weaponized her self-sufficiency against her, labeling her a sterile utility, simply because she did not fit their narrow, traditional definition of a successful daughter. They taught her that loyalty is punishable by erasure. When we raise our children, we must ensure that the reward for responsibility is not simply heavier burdens. If we only pour our love and resources into the cracks of our most broken children, we inevitably starve the ones who are silently holding the foundation together. The invisible child eventually learns to stop seeking a seat at a table that was never set for them. Grandfather Thomas understood this delicate, vital balance. He stands as the narrative's true north for long-term guidance. He loved his family enough to deny them what they wanted in order to give them what they desperately needed. He recognized that wealth transferred without discipline is merely a fast track to ruin. His restrictive trust was not an act of malice, it was an act of profound, tough love. He was attempting to parent from beyond the grave, enforcing the rigid boundaries that Richard and Evelyn were too weak to set themselves. In a society where generational wealth is so frequently squandered by the third generation, Thomas's foresight highlights a crucial parenting value. Sometimes the greatest gift you can leave your children is a locked door that forces them to find their own key. The Browns' descent into felony forgery was not just about saving Harrison. It was about saving themselves from social embarrassment. Evelyn's desperate, calculated spinning at the Coral Gables Country Club reveals the toxic underbelly of prioritizing public optics over genuine honesty. We live in a society that frequently rewards the appearance of perfection. The manicured lawns, the leased luxury cars, the perfectly posed family portraits over the messy, difficult reality of integrity. But when parents build their identity on the opinions of their wealthy peers, rather than the honest truth of their own home, they teach their children that deception is a valid survival strategy. Naomi and Harrison learned this lesson perfectly, constructing a marriage and a life entirely out of leveraged debt, hollow status symbols, and frantic lies. A family structure built on a foundation of deceit, no matter how beautifully painted the exterior may be, will inevitably collapse the moment it is forced to bear real, unforgiving weight. We all have a choice in how we lay the bricks of our own family foundations. Will we build with the solid mortar of fairness, honesty, and emotional awareness? Or will we build with the fragile glass of favoritism and social prestige? These are the quiet, critical choices that define our legacies long after we are gone. If you have ever felt the heavy, silent burden of being the dependable child in a family that only celebrates the golden one, or if you simply value stories that explore the complex, often messy reality of human boundaries and consequences, you are not alone. Join our community and follow the channel Linda Vengeance for more true-to-life stories about dignity, poetic justice, and the exact moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit into a room they already own. We explore the deep shadows of family dynamics so you can find the light and clarity in your own. As the dust settles on the Coral Gables estate, Bonita stands alone on the master balcony, sipping her vintage Cabernet in absolute silence. She has reclaimed her dignity and her heritage, but the victory is undeniably solitary. Miles away, her parents are unpacking cardboard boxes in the cramped apartment of the son who ruined them, trapped in a purgatory of their own meticulous design. It is a stark, haunting image that asks us to look closely at our own dining room tables. When we slide a glass of tap water to one child and pour expensive wine for another, we are not just serving a meal, we are writing a destiny. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway continues to tick, keeping its own slow, steady time. It reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply we bury it in the wood, is always waiting to be uncovered. Look around your own home tonight. Listen to the quiet rhythms of the people you love. Are the walls supporting your family built on truth, or are they just waiting for the right moment to collapse?